there you have it. With that, we can get started. So good morning. Really nice. I've seen some familiar faces popping up in the waiting room. So really happy to have all of you, or familiar names. I guess your face isn't in the waiting room, but happy to have all of you joining us for this conversation. My name's Elena Keegan. I'm on staff at Triangle J, and I'm going to be sort of facilitating this conversation today. We've got some guests from RTI joining us to talk about the survey that we sent out in late 2022 and the results of that survey. Before I get into that, quick logistics, bear with me. I know everyone's heard these. We will be recording. So as I said, just a note on that. We ask that everyone be muted. There will be some time for Q&A, and we're more than happy to have folks unmute and talk at that time. But until then, we ask that you just stay muted for the sake of everyone not hearing multiple voices over each other. And then the chat will be monitored. So if you have questions, or if you want to put questions in the chat for when we get to the Q&A portion, you're more than welcome to do that. We'll definitely make sure that we try and address all of those when we get to the Q&A portion. So with that, here is our agenda for the day. So we have an hour with all of you. We're going to try and talk through a couple of things. I'm going to quickly give some context on who is Triangle J. I know for some of you, this is not new information, but for some of you, it might be. And why we are talking about this topic with all of you. And then we're going to talk about the survey results, and Mike Hogan, who's here with us from RTI, will present that information to you. And then we'll talk about next steps. So we've been talking about this data for some time with members. We've been presenting across the region about the results, and we keep hearing, understandably, so what do we do with this information? And we want to make sure we give you a sense of where we're headed with it and what we see as some valuable next steps. So I'm not going to get into the weeds on this. If you have not worked with a regional council before, we are one of 16 in the state. So there is the entire state of North Carolina is covered by a regional council. And if you've been invited to this webinar, it's probably because you're within the 7 counties that we represent in North Carolina. We are a unique sort of organization. We are not a nonprofit. We are not quasi-government. We are actually a local government by law. And we're governed by our local government. So there's 47 local governments that are considered to be members of the organization. They make up our governing body. They make decisions for the organization and really guide what we do. And so we're really responsive to local governments as a result of that. This is our region, so you might be able to see your own jurisdiction on this map. As I mentioned, 47 local governments. All 7 counties are members of the organization, and 40 municipalities within that. And we really pride ourselves on being responsive to all of our municipalities. So our work ranges and changes over time. This topic of recruitment and retention and workforce challenges is a newer conversation, and that's because we're able to be responsive and hope to be responsive to our local governments as new items emerge. We have 6 areas of focus for our organization, and the one that this work that we're talking about today really falls under is called our member support and strategy focus area. So there's a lot of challenges and opportunities in the community, and that's what most of our focus areas are focused on. Things like transportation and housing and water resources and community resilience. This area of focus is really trying to make sure that your organizations are able to respond to all those other challenges. And so we have a range of assistance that we do in this focus area, but really we're hoping to just strengthen your organization as both a workplace and as a service provider. So why are we talking about recruitment, retention, and workforce stability? This topic emerged, it's been talked about for some time. We actually, in early 2018, I believe, had launched a recruitment effort with some of our law enforcement partners, but it became a broader issue that we were noticing was coming up in every single meeting we were having with folks in early 2022. And so we convened a group of our member governments. It was specifically city, county managers, and HR directors. representing all 7 counties. So at least one representative from each of our 7 counties to talk about this issue and talk through the challenges they were having with recruitment and retention, and maybe some opportunities that they saw the COG playing a role in. After that conversation, we conducted a pretty extensive literature and programmatic review nationally to get a sense of what is happening around recruitment, retention, and workforce stability. This is not a challenge that is unique to our region. And as Mike might even mention in his presentation, it's not a challenge that's unique to just the public sector. And so we wanted to get a sense of what's being done and some best practices that are out there, so we didn't duplicate things that already existed. After that, we determined that we needed to really dedicate some time to it. So we found that it was a challenge that didn't have any good national best practices of how to resolve it for the public sector. And we saw it as a really big concern for COVID recovery for our local governments, capacity challenges being the most important of that. So we dedicated some of our own American Rescue Plan funding that we received from the state to cover staff time to at least launch this initiative and give us a chance to really help you understand opportunities to improve your own recruitment and retention efforts. And with that, we decided that the next best thing to do would be to get a real sense of what is happening in each of our local governments. So there are some national surveys that have been done, or other regional surveys around workforce challenges. We really wanted to dive into the unique challenges for our region. We have a unique market here. And so that's how we entered into this partnership with RTI to conduct a survey of our local governments and really get a full picture of what is happening around the workforce and employee well-being. And so with that, I am going to turn it over to Mike to talk about this survey. So he's really gonna walk through the whole process that they undertook and the results, and then we'll have some time for Q&A for anyone that has questions. So I'm gonna stop sharing, Mike, and then you can pull up your.
Thank you, Alana, and good morning, everybody. It's good to be here with you today. And I make sure that I'm sharing the right screen.
You're good.
Alana, is coming through okay? So good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here today. I wanted to take just a brief minute to introduce myself and our research team and a little bit about us and what we do before going into a bit of our background, why we did this work, and what were our the principal things we learned from it. A lot of you are going to be familiar with this survey because a lot of you took this survey. So again, thank you so much for taking it. As somebody who does a lot of surveys, everything depends on getting good data from the folks who are living and working in this field day to day. So a big thank you to you. Again, my name is Michael Hogan. I'm here with my colleague Pearl Sullivan. We're with RTI. We're based in Research Triangle Park, and we are a very large applied research institute doing work all over the US, all around the world. Ranging from economic issues, education, workforce, governance, public health, environment. But North Carolina is our home. The well-being of everything that happens in the Triangle and the TJCOG region directly impacts us. And so it's very important that we take what we do and apply it here in North Carolina. The background on this, as Alana mentioned, is that as part of TJCOG's initiatives and part of our work, we're constantly taking a look at the state of the workforce and the well-being of the workforce. We do a number of surveys across North Carolina with private sector employers on their recruiting and retention efforts. We've been doing private sector surveys going back to 2017 and did a recent survey last year in the Land of Sky and Asheville, Western North Carolina region with nearly 1,000 employers across many private sector industries. But this is an interesting challenge to us and a bit of a background because as we were looking at the work that TJCOG had highlighted, something really stood out to us, which was a survey of local government staff in Los Angeles. It was conducted by the USC Price School of Government, and highlighted kind of in those 3 years between 2018 and 2020, they're tracking a number of factors that are driving high rates of vacancy in public sector and local government positions. As you see here, stress, burnout, bureaucracy, low wages, accelerated retirement, and public distrust, including kind of the emotional labor and difficulty and burnout working with constituents, and the accelerated pressure in the 2020 kind of pandemic era, and the shifting role of government and work and pressure put on government employees, and a greater sense of being overworked and overwhelmed coming from women, workers of color, and LGBTQ employees. Again, this is a very extensive 3-year study focused on kind of individual mental health of many different workers within the public sector. And what we wanted to do was take this and see, what is the state of the public sector workforce in the Triangle region? What can we learn from this group? And with a particular eye on knowing that while we don't have in this instance, the resources to do a 3-year extensive study, what can we learn about the state of the public sector workforce in the Triangle region, and what are the factors that are affecting worker well-being? So we sent the survey in September and October of last year. We got 118 total responses, so between 31 and 32% response rate. I kind of jokingly say at RTI that if we get above a 20% response rate, that's great. So getting a pretty high response rate for us is indicative that this is a very important and very relevant topic for this group. And I, as a lot of you know, because you took the survey. So again, thank you. As we're looking at the data, and I'm going to spend about 10 minutes talking about the data and some of the principal findings of it. Keep in mind that it was voluntary. This was a point in time, so it's not necessarily meant to be for other places or other contexts. The responses reflect, for the most part, managers, supervisors, and HR professionals. So it's not entirely indicative of the whole workforce, and particularly looking at the last point, that we're asking generally about workplace well-being and not about personal mental health. It's important to us to make sure that we're not collecting data on people's personal health or personal information. So with that, I'm going to just give a little bit of an introduction of what our responses looked like. Again, as you saw in the previous slide, about half of our responses came from Wake County, 47%, and then the remainder coming from the remaining counties, Moore, Johnston, Durham, and Orange. We even had one from Harnett County, which is just outside of the TJCOG region. And our respondents profile is generally reflective more of when you take a look at their profile of our respondents, it's 56% male and 83% white. So one thing to keep in mind as we're looking at the data is that we may not have received all of the perspectives on the well-being of the public sector workforce, particularly looking back at the results that we saw from the USC survey. So with that, I want to get into the survey responses and talk about kind of 6 key questions that we asked of the respondents and what those key takeaways were from those responses. So to start off, we just asked, describe the current state of the workforce, looking at a number of different kind of factors that affected workplace well-being, and seeing to what degree people agreed with those statements. And so when we think about kind of the ones towards the top, staff taking leave, taking time off, taking advantage of benefits, organizational leadership, and workplace culture, about 3/4 agreed or strongly agreed that there was kind of an internally a strong ability to take time off, use benefits, be valued by that organizational leadership. But when we get down towards the bottom and we have fewer than 60%, or in some cases fewer than 50% agreeing, it does raise some of the concerns that we saw early on. First, that a lower share seeing staff being valued by the community, staff being valued by elected officials, and then the last, compensation and benefits being competitive with comparable private sector and non-government positions. So these are three components that we're going to look at a little bit more as we move forward. We asked then how the workforce had changed in the last 3 years, excuse me, the last 2 years. And again, looking at where was our largest share of folks who agreed or strongly agreed with some of the statements. We look at the top and overwhelmingly, nearly 90% saying that it's more difficult to recruit skilled workers into the public sector. As we'll see later, this is reflective across all components of the workforce, but also that our staff have had to take on other responsibilities and staff have had to work overtime or beyond their regular work hours. But notice down at the bottom that the need to scale back services has been much lower. Only 28% said that their division needed to scale back services. So in an environment where staff are having more responsibilities placed on them and working more overtime, many government and public sector divisions have not had to scale back services. So they're seeing that staff are working beyond their kind of normal roles and responsibilities. We ask what is driving employees to leave or consider leaving the organization. We received a number of interesting responses, but looking at those top 4 that are at around or above 50%, the first and second being wages and recruitment from the private sector. That in a very competitive labor market right now, particularly in the Triangle region where we see that the cost of living is going up, cost of housing, inflation, wages have become a real driving factor. And with a very tight labor market and a lot of recruitment coming from the private sector, that's a driving force. But also the next 2, lack of opportunities for growth and development and stress and burnout kind of come in around 50% of reasons that employees are giving when they consider leaving the organization. Some of the others have a little bit lower response rate, but I think that those top 4 are a real, something to really pay attention to. And I know that the kind of the state of the workforce broadly, and we see this in the private sector as well, those first 2 are a big driver in a lot of challenges around employee turnover and employee recruitment and retention. But the lack of opportunities for growth and development and stress and burnout are ones that we don't see quite as often in the private sector. And so it's something that we want to be paying attention to as we move forward. When we ask managers what are the primary obstacles to recruiting and retaining that skilled workforce, they do align quite a bit with what the challenges were before about retention, particularly that wages and private sector recruitment. Many divisions are just seeing fewer and fewer skilled applicants. Housing affordability and cost of living is another primary obstacle to recruiting and retaining that workforce. And then all additional ones, including red tape and bureaucracy and lack of public support. So these kind of face a bit about what managers are seeing in the workforce within the workplace and then the labor market more broadly as to why people are leaving and why people are staying, what is driving people to leave or to pursue other work outside the public sector. This has a number of responses, and this slide is also available in more detail on the website. But when we ask about the types of resources that are currently being offered, and that's our dark blue bar there, and then ones that they would like to offer, which are the light blue. The greatest kind of things that are currently being offered, a lot of EAP and healthcare navigator programs are currently being offered. Some professional development, some access to mental health programs are all currently being offered. But one thing that we noticed is that employers were not sensing that their employees were more likely to use those programs or have a higher interest in the EAP or healthcare navigator programs. So we're seeing that there are a lot of resources being made available to staff, but what this doesn't ask is how much staff are really using them, but also providing flexible leave and flexible hours, fitness benefits, gym memberships, mentoring, and then things like financial planning, student loan assistance, and childcare are towards the bottom of what's currently being offered. And they're also among those that employers would like to offer, things including fitness benefits, financial planning, student loan assistance, and childcare, among kind of the resources that respondents would like to be able to offer to their staff. And finally, we did break down one of the questions by department, so you can get a sense of where the differences are across the departments. Again, these slides are going to be made available to everybody, so I know there's a lot going on here, but I did want to show you that these 4 questions, we thought, all right, let's break these out and let's see where the variability is across our divisions. So over here on the far right, it's more difficult to recruit skilled workers into the public sector. That we see across all of the divisions. These are just limited to divisions where we got a high enough response rate to be able to get meaningful comparisons. There was kind of a mix though when we see kind of staff being valued by the community and staff being valued by elected officials. So law enforcement and fire had a good perception of the community, but a bit lower kind of agreement on their perception by elected officials. And then at the same time, planning had among the lowest perception of being valued by the community. But then again, across, when we look at our third column here, having to scale back services due to a lack of staff, across the board, there were very few that said that they had to scale back services. So in an environment where the labor market is tight and it's been more difficult to recruit and retain, we've seen that in a lot of cases, employees have stepped up and working overtime, working extra to be able to keep the level of service the same. So I'm going to spend about 5 more minutes just talking about a couple of high-level themes and takeaways, and then we'll have a few minutes for Q&A to talk a bit about the data, and then move into what are we doing next. So the first thing, and I think that this is across the board, that wages are just a driving factor. And this is in the labor market that we're in right now. We see this in the private sector. Nearly 3/4 said wages are an obstacle to recruiting and retaining. 64% said wages are the primary reason employees are leaving. And fewer than half are saying that compensation and benefits can compete with the private sector. And so in a case where a worker can just make more money in the private sector doing the same job, it's a kind of an overarching reality of being in a very competitive labor market. Staff are working beyond their normal hours and responsibilities. This was really striking to us when we saw that 81% said staff are working beyond their responsibilities and 70% are working overtime or extended hours. But only about 1/4 of respondents had to cut back on services. And so we saw overwhelmingly from managers just a broad appreciation for how public staff and managers are going the extra mile. And there's ever increasing workloads and ongoing recruitment and retention issues, and managers are very aware of this. Managers have a perception that their staff are not very highly valued by constituents, by elected officials. Only 58% said staff were valued by the community, and 55% agreed they were valued by elected officials. And there are cases and managers that are really seeing this more hostile work environment coming from both the public and from board meetings, council meetings, and communication with staff during work hours and outside of work hours that are making for a more stressful work environment. The public safety sector, and we're looking at law enforcement and fire, faces really unique challenges. It's a very competitive market between law enforcement agencies. There's fewer qualified candidates, and agencies are competing more with talent. Public safety jobs are hard, and they're difficult to compare. It's difficult to compete with the private sector. Again, working late nights, weekends, holidays, dangerous conditions. And the agencies are still recovering from staffing losses associated with kind of 2020, 2021, but staffing levels are starting to come back. And managers are really recognizing that need invest in the well-being of the public sector workforce. And this is what I wanted to close on for this sector, is that managers are seeing that about half the time that professional development and stress and burnout are a primary reason that employees are leaving. So they see the importance of investing in people, investing in organizational culture, investing in opportunities for professional development, and allowing for a work environment where people want to be. And in some cases, these are trends we see across the private sector as well. And so managers are seeing the value of that, and they recognize the need to invest in well-being. This is sort of why you're all here today. So I just want to thank you all for your attention and for your time this morning. I know that it can be a bit of a drag to listen to someone talk about data for too long. So I want to make sure that this is really a focused conversation. We have more data and more breakouts and data kind of breakdowns that are available. And some of those are on the TJCOG website, or if there are other specific questions that you have regarding kind of specific data, and if it's something that we can do and we can share with you, my email is mhogan@rti.org, and you're welcome to reach out to me, and we will try to kind of get you a good answer to your question if it is within the survey data that we have. So I just, again, want to thank everyone for their time this morning, and I want to leave a few minutes for the kind of Q&A and discussion portion. I'm going to turn off my screen share and see if we've want to get started with any questions, either via the chat, or if folks want to chime in in person, please let us know.
Yeah, feel free to put comments or questions in the chat or unmute. We have a small enough group. I think we can do that. I just wanted to share what Dan said with you, Mike. Excellent data. Look forward to sharing the slides, and we'll definitely make sure to share out all of this information. There's, as Mike mentioned, a couple of additional breakouts by gender and by department that can give you a sense of what folks responded. Are there any questions that you'd like to run by the team? We will send the slides with the recording, so that will probably be tomorrow.
And the slides are also available. An older version of the slides are available online.
Yeah.
On TJCOG's website.
Mike, I wonder if you want to just, you mentioned a couple of this a couple times in your presentation, but just stressing what is similar versus what is unique between these responses and some of the private sector folks you've worked with.
Yeah, of course. I think that the other recent workforce survey that we did just prior to doing this one was with the Land of Sky Regional Council and stakeholders across Western North Carolina. And the environment's a little bit different. Western North Carolina is very different from the Triangle, but for a broad group of kind of private and public sector employers, one big piece for them, which we hear about all the time, is affordable housing. That the need for affordable housing across every industry there in Western North Carolina is huge, and it's becoming kind of the inhibiting factor for a lot of economic growth and job growth in the region. So we've seen that similarly in this data. We've seen a very similar response. I think the other one is that one of the questions that we ask is about, especially within the private sector, is how do you recruit and recruit staff? So thinking about the avenues that private sector companies use to source their talent, where do they find people, how do they recruit, what tools are they using? And especially among the small business community, it's a lot more reliant on kind of who you know and friends and networks, and kind of having access to those networks. Within the public sector, there are more structured tools that public sector organizations use to recruit and retain. And then there's a little bit more rigidity around credentials that are required. So in the public sector, there'll be jobs that will require a 4-year degree or require a certain credential, whereas in the private sector, oftentimes employers can have more flexibility around those sorts of credentials and certificates. So those were two kind of high-level differences. And then the other one is, this is really the first time that we've asked about some of these driving forces in retention that are things like opportunities for professional development, stress and burnout, pressure from constituents and elected officials, which are areas that we don't see quite the same. I think we saw a pretty overwhelming response around the burnout piece in the healthcare sector, which was a similar, had similar challenges around retention, around burnout, around interaction with patients. And so we saw this in the public sector as well, that kind of a high, the level of pressure that comes from elected officials and constituents is not something you see in every private sector industry. So that places an additional level of stress on public sector employees. And then, one of the things that has historically been a driver for the public sector is having good wages and good benefits, and when people are saying that the wages and benefits are not comparable or are not competitive with the private sector, that creates another challenge. So those are a couple of the key differences that we've seen from when we have this conversation with private sector companies. At the same time, there's a lot of stuff that's similar. The wages issue is very similar. We're in a very tight labor market right now. Affordability, cost of living, housing is a very, very relevant issue right now. And then opportunities for professional growth and development, all of which you see in the public and private sector.
Thank you. Any other questions on the data before we move on to now what? As I mentioned, that is what folks, they're like, now what? What do we do? Now we know all of this. Okay. Well, if you have other questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat as we're continuing on. We've got some more time. So I'm going to pull up some additional slides to talk about now what. And just give me 1 second. All right. So I am going to cover a couple of things that Triangle J is working on. We have a lot. So as you can see from that survey, there is a lot of content that we're continuing to sort of think through and don't necessarily have some next steps for you at this moment, but that does not mean that we're not trying to think through some opportunities. There's just a lot of next steps that could be taken. So we want to make sure we're intentional about each one that we take on. I wanted to quickly share, so some of you may have attended our summit last fall. That was when we first released this survey information. So it was November of 2022. And one of the things we did after Mike presented the data was ask folks in the room to share with us what they thought was the biggest issue that the survey identified. And this room was, there was a lot of elected officials in the room, as well as some staff and partner organizations. And some of these will not be surprising. They sort of track with the data that Mike shared. But it identifies a couple of additional ones that I wanted to highlight. Workplace culture being one of the biggest issues, burnout, appreciation from the community, and the need for additional data. So this is just some additional feedback that we received from folks that have seen this information. So we have used the survey as well as a number of other sort of feedback opportunities with members to format this initiative we're calling our Public Workforce Initiative. And we have 4 goals that we're trying to move forward, make progress on through this initiative. Those are related to employee well-being, improved resources for pay and equity. So that's really related to that salaries and benefits item. More data on workforce trends and needs. So this survey is one piece of that. We hope to continue to have more data collection in the future. And then an improved pipeline for development, which really gets to the challenges around enough candidates applying, enough skilled candidates applying, and just a general sort of interest in public sector jobs. So I'm going to talk about 3 different initiatives that we have launched that are in relation to those goals. So our first is the Public Pipeline Program. And this is in pilot phase or in design, and it will be piloting in summer of 2023. We had a kickoff in late January with a number of local governments and a number of folks in the community college and HBCU realm. We're really hoping to make this have an impact on the pipeline itself. So we have had a lot of feedback on this program and have determined that this is really going to be something that focuses on what we're calling hard to fill positions. And so we know there's a general recruitment issue in local government, but there are some positions, I think Mike mentioned this with the public safety comments, that are a lot harder to compare to other positions and are therefore harder to recruit. And these are things like the utilities sector, our water and wastewater positions, public works, public safety, of course, and engineers. And so we are going to be working through this spring we've got a working group of folks from, I believe, about 10 local governments that have sort of signed up to help us pilot this program. And this is going to be a formal internship apprenticeship program for those positions. So we're really hoping we're going to be testing out a couple of models. So we're not entirely sure how it will look yet. We think it will be housed at Triangle J, but we're not entirely sure how the interns will be structured, whether it will be that we're sort of matching interns with communities or actually housing them at Triangle J and just facilitating project work in your community. So we're going to be testing that out soon. The next thing that we are looking to launch is a pay and classification consortium. So I've seen some names. I know there's a lot of HR directors on this call, and so you're very familiar with pay and classification studies. We have seen in the past couple of years a rapid increase in requests for pay and classification studies. We actually partner at Triangle J with our COG to the west, the Piedmont Triad COG, to conduct pay and class studies. And we have seen, I think the number is 23 at this point, local governments ask us for at least one pay and class or market study in the past 2 years, and some have done that multiple times trying to keep up with the market. And we're also aware that that number, the 20-something number, is not representative of every community that is conducting these studies regularly. And one thing we've sort of identified as a challenge and an opportunity is that everyone is individually collecting this information, and there's a lot of time spent on that and a lot of money spent on that. And we really think there's a better way to go about that. So we are in very early concept development stages, but we are looking to get local governments to sign on to a real-time sort of salary database of some sort. So we can't address the classification element as much at a regional level, right? I know there's a lot of folks that have different methodologies or guiding sort of how they just determine what class is what and what sorts of skill sets fall into what class, but we can help with the pay piece. And so we are going to be in the next couple of months sending out materials on this. I know many of you have probably heard us talk about it a little bit, but we're really hoping to have the first year launch be where we're really collecting data, getting information on current salaries, thinking through the process of how we would collect that from you over time and make a database that's accessible to all of our local governments. So hopefully what that would do down the road is you're not doing the pay part, right, of your pay and classification, which is the majority of the data collection that you do when you do these studies, is just gathering what each individual person is making and does it match their class and what salaries are you posting at. We're really hoping to sort of reduce the amount of time that is spent on that. And then another thing that we have finally launched, we're really excited about this one as well, is our Recruitment Marketing Collaborative. So I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar that we have previously done a law enforcement recruitment effort, and that was done in 2018 and 2019. We had a number of police departments that were involved in that effort and did a joint marketing campaign around law enforcement careers. And so we're going to be building on that example. We have a couple of public information officers and communications directors who are going to be guiding this discussion, and actually were the ones that initiated it. And so we are having our first meeting of that group later this month. And we're really hoping to make it both an opportunity for marketing, communication, and HR staff to come together and talk about what they're doing and what's working, and also potentially find some opportunities for joint marketing. So this could be, we hope it will be both a combination of marketing for individual positions. How are you talking about your positions? How are you communicating them to the public and in jobs, when you're searching for candidates, but also how are we talking about public service careers? And there's some really good work nationally being done on this topic that we're hoping to build from. So we will not be recreating the wheel on this at all. And that is all I've got. So I want to just pause for a minute. I don't know if there's any questions on the work being done or feedback that you'd like to share at this time. Awesome. So we're doing everything right. Well, I think I'm not seeing anything in the chat. I don't want to jump over anyone. Oh, here we go. So this is, yeah, it's a great question. With regard to recruitment and retention, have there been data on skills and diplomas? I don't have a direct answer for degrees and requirements for folks that are not from the United States. I will say there's been a broader conversation around requirements for positions and how strict the public sector can often be with those requirements. And so one of the things we've talked about with the pipeline program specifically is making sure that our positions are, they seem open to individuals with lots of backgrounds, right? So we had our kickoff meeting 3 weeks ago, and we had an individual join us from Wake Tech who's running one of their large programs around pipeline development. And she talked about the importance of making sure that we focus on skills and not sort of degree requirements, right? So what do you need from a person to do this job correctly? And how can you make sure that it's not making a candidate look at the job description and think, I don't have this 4-year degree, so I'm not going to even try and apply. And so we see that as an opportunity that we could potentially help provide some guidance on for local government. Some of that does happen at the individual organization level in terms of your methodology for how you put together job descriptions, but there's definitely a need for focusing more on skills to recruit candidates. So it's a great question. Yes. Hi, Sheila. Yes, we will be making the slides and the recording available after this. Any other questions? Awesome. Well, with that, we will wrap up. We'll stay on for a few minutes. If you want to just ask us something one-on-one, feel free to stay on. But with that, we will stop recording and call it a day. So have a great day, everyone. Have a good rest of your week, and we will be in touch soon.